I am so very excited to welcome our next guest to Off the Podium, an Olympic historian, somebody who really should be hosting this podcast more than me, because I guarantee you he would be an absolute gun at hosting an Olympics podcast. He has been to every Olympics since 1996, Summer Olympics. He has also carried the flame in the past. He has been to multiple Winter Olympics, has written a book on the Olympic flame, and I met him on the ground in Paris on the way to breaking, which we are definitely going to be talking about today. He's also a member of the International Olympic Historian Society. He's written for Inside the Games, a regular contributor for that website, and so many more things on his resume that I simply could fill the entire introduction for another hour with. But I'm going to introduce him right now so he can talk more about him and his own career. Philip Barker is on the line and he's with me now. Philip, first of all, welcome to Off the Podium. It's an honor. It's an honor to have you on the show today.
I don't think that, but it's always great to talk about Olympic Games and various things that happen with the games, because although they only take place once every 4 years, and the Olympic Winter Games only take place once every 4 years, the Olympic cycle goes for the whole 4 years. An Olympiad is in fact 4 years.
Exactly.
And there are lots of things going on in the meantime. And a lot of the background and the other aspects of this are really quite special. So it'll be fun to explore some of those.
Well, I'm looking forward to exploring some of those along the way, because I'm gonna have to ask the obvious question and take you right back to the beginning, Philip. Like, how did this passion for the Olympics start? What was it that sparked your interest in the Olympic Games?
Well, the family legend is that I was 3 years old when Tokyo 1964 were the Olympics, and they were the first to really have television extensively. Satellites had just come in, and in fact, a lot of the stuff wasn't live, but it was beamed over, flown over, sent by satellites up to point A, and then flown the rest of the way, and then transmitted on the BBC. And I was only 3 years old, so I have very little recollection of that. But my dad used to make sure that whenever the broadcast came on, I was sitting in front of it. Now, whether anything went in subconsciously, I don't know. I started watching the Olympics in the late 60s. I have a vague memory of Mexico, but more of a memory of the Munich Olympics, which were in color at the right time of day. You're at school with all your friends from school, and at 10 and 11 years old, this was very, very exciting to see all this great athletics, swimming, Mark Spitz in the swimming, the athletics with Lasse Viren of Finland doing the 5,000 and 10,000 meters double. Mary Peters winning what was then the pentathlon, is now the heptathlon, but then it was only 5 events for women, the multi-event. And superstars like John Akibua in the 400 meters hurdles. Bit of the show jumping as well, just watching everything that was happening, this multiplicity of sports all around the globe. And to see that for the first time in our living rooms, in living color as well, was really a tremendous thing. And of course, once you watch it as a child, the commentators play a big part too. We had a very famous commentator in England called David Coleman, who used to front all the BBC broadcasts, and his voice was so distinctive that you became watching the sport and you could actually recite what he'd actually said at any given moment. So those
like
first
me and Bruce
games,
McAvaney in Australia. That was me and Bruce McAvaney just every single time during the Olympics.
Pretty much so, yes. Yeah. Bruce has the same kind of aura there, and you've got Jim McKay from ABC in America, and then Bob Costa, and yeah. Each country has their own memory of the voice. There's a chap in Greece who now he's retired, but he used to be the master of ceremonies when the flame was lit. And all the Greek people, when you said, "Oh, have you met Alexis Kostas?" they said, "Ah, yes, the voice." And so every country has their Olympic voice that everybody associates with the great moments of the games. And David Coleman was that for us. And of course, as someone who aspired to a career in sports journalism and in sports broadcasting, that was quite inspirational to hear his voice. I mean, he had a wonderful way of describing the events. He spoke in headlines, And in 1980, we had a great moment when Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett had their rivalry. These were two middle distance runners who very rarely, I should say, met on the track. They were setting records at the various events around the continent. There was one golden summer when one evening it would be Seb setting a world record. The following evening it would be Steve setting a world best in another event. And these two, they were rivals with a great deal of respect for one another. They were built up as arch enemies, which I don't think they actually were, because they were both athletes and respected what the other one was doing. But David Coleman was describing the 800 meters in Moscow, which Sebastian Coe was expected to win. And Steve Ovett was supposed to win the 1,500 meters. The 800 meters takes place at the beginning of the week. And what happens? Ovett wins it. But as Ovett came round the final bend, Coleman came out with this marvelous line. Ovett, those blue eyes like chips of ice. And that encapsulated his desire to go on and win that race. And what a line for any aspiring commentator. It was just a brilliant line. And it's something I can remember, 40 odd years on. And that shows how good it was and how memorable it was. But the race itself, and Ovett came through to win and take the gold medal in the 800 meters. A week later, Sebastian Coe won the 1,500 meters. That everybody had written him off. It just shows the way that we are certainly in my profession in sports journalism, where we tend to write someone off. I mean, if they've done something, they failed in one event, the idea that they might bounce back the following week and achieve what they were setting out to is something that people don't seem to give a consideration to. There are myriad examples from the whole world of sport of somebody coming back after failing one week and being completely written off. And this is what happened with Seb Coe. He came across the line to win the 1,500 meters. And indeed, he even won it in Los Angeles 4 years later. So, you've got superstars like you're watching, and you can't fail to be inspired by them. Whether you're a sportsman or whether you're an aspiring journalist, as I was then, these moments, these golden inspirational moments are very, very important.
So it was more of a case of, are you taking in the commentators and the media side of things? Was there ever an aspiration for you to be an athlete, to become an Olympian in a sport or something?
I think if you've ever seen me play football, cricket, athletics or anything else, you might know the answer to that. They have this phrase, them that can do, them that can't either coach or talk about it. And I'm certainly in the second category, we all try hard at sport and we all get a great deal, whatever level you play at, you actually get a great kick out of play, provided that the other people are at your level. But put it this way, if I'd have had to face up to someone like Dennis Lilly or Jeff Thompson, I think I would have struggled. And that's putting it mildly.
I know the feeling all too well with that one. You attended the International Olympic Academy in 1983. I believe you were still at university. I mean, give us a taste of what that actually is and how that helped with what has ultimately become this amazing career involved in the Olympics and the Olympic movement.
I was studying history. I read history at Lancaster University, and we had a scheme of study there that you could also come up with something called independent studies, where you would devise for one unit of your course something that was special, that you were interested in, that you'd like to do some research in. So I proposed a thing about sport and the media. And it just so happened that at that time, the Falklands War was on. This was 1982 when I was sort of thinking about this. And I'd noticed that the way that the newspapers were reporting on the war, particularly the tabloid newspapers in England, this was like the Sun newspaper was the arch tabloid, what we call the Red Tops, the very populist newspaper, were reporting on the war almost as if they were reporting on a football match. And I noticed that when the World Cup of 1982 started, this was the same thing. And I thought there was a confluence between these two. So I proposed that I did something on the way that the war was reported and how this carried on into the World Cup. And one of my tutors who was supervising this particular bit of study came in one day and he said, this might be of interest to you. They have this study centre in Greece at ancient Olympia, the place where the ancient Olympics started in 776 BC and went on to 393 AD. So they have this study centre called the International Olympic Academy. Why don't you apply and see if you can go on their course? So I sent off a application, curriculum vitae, a little letter saying why I thought this would benefit me. And lo and behold, about 6 weeks later, they said, we've come up to London for an interview. So
Wow.
I went, sat down in this room, called in, asked a few questions. Thank you very much. Off you go. So I went away thinking nothing of it. And about 6 weeks later, a letter with British Olympic Association Newt paper came through, said, I'm delighted to say that you're one of 4 people chosen to go to ancient Olympia.
On a
We
4.
will send you
Wow.
details. So, and this was in July 1983. All the flights were paid for, hotels and everything. And I'd only ever been abroad once before then, to France for a school trip. And we were flown to Greece. We were taken up to the Hill of Pnyx in the center of Athens, which is just across from the Acropolis. And this is where they had all the debates in the old days, because Athens was the home of democracy. Obviously, not quite the democracy that we understand now, but they used to have their debates on this hill. And we were taken there just before dusk. So you could see the Acropolis in the background, the Olympic hymn. The president of the International Olympic Committee at that time was Juan Antonio Samaranch.
His Excellency.
That people in Australia will know, because he was the one who came up with the Aussie, Aussie, Aussie at the closing of Sydney. But he was this little Spanish diplomat who became president, an all-powerful leader of the Olympic movement. And he gave a speech, and then there were choir singing and so on and so forth. And we were taken down to ancient Olympia. And we crossed the Corinth Canal and down right into the Peloponnese. And nestling above the site of the ancient stadium is this wonderful academy, which has accommodation blocks, dining rooms, lecture halls, and so forth. And for 2 weeks, there was a program of lectures about the Olympic movement, guest speakers from all over the place. People who competed in the Olympics would talk about their experiences. We even had Jean Borotra came as a guest. He was one of the 4 musketeers of French tennis who dominated international tennis in the 1920s. And he came to talk about something, and other Olympic champions there as well, academics, you name it, all about aspects of something to do with the Olympic Games. And so so this was where it really started to crystallize. I was still at university, realized there was a lot more to the Olympics than just those 2 weeks every 4 years. And the enthusiasm that was founded there, I thought, yes, I rather like this. And of course, over the next few years, I built up a sort of interest. I was lucky enough to work for a television program called Transworld Sport. And this was an international program that was founded by a very famous sports agent called Mark McCormack. He was the guy who really founded the whole idea of sportsmen being represented. And he had this television arm called Transworld International, so hence the name Transworld Sport. And Transworld Sport was a weekly program, and every week we would do all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. We'd do historical Olympic moments, great Olympic moments, great sports moments. We'd interview some sporting superstar. We'd even find strange sports like, for example, kabaddi from Asia, or sepak takraw, the game where they play, it's like tennis with the feet. So there was a mixture of traditional sports that we know, even occasionally a cricket story when I could persuade them. And so I worked on that, and we did some stories on the Olympic movement. We actually went out to Lausanne and filmed the IOC in situ to explain what they did, what their role was within the Olympics, spoke to people. And Prince Rainier, who had briefly been a member, he was the prince in charge of Monaco at that time. Now Prince Albert, his son, is the hereditary ruler of Monaco. But Prince Rainier, who married the film star Grace Kelly, he gave us an interview, and I said to him, "Should we speak in Monegasque?" And he said, "Oh, good God, no! We'll do it in French because we had to do it in the language and then translate." So my very bad French is somewhere on some tape somewhere, asking him questions about the
Wow.
philosophy of the Olympic movement. But we did that, and we started to sort of build a sort of thing where we'd actually do the Olympic movement a little bit more than just the 100 meters final, the swimming final, or whatever. So we'd end up doing the stories behind how it worked, what the federations were, who the superstars were that were emerging. And so that helped to build my interest in the Olympic movement. And then, of course, you go on, and everywhere you go, you try and find some ways forward. And of course, when London finally got the Olympic Games in 2005, I'd been lucky enough at that time to have been to a few Olympics, but that was the moment. And I was lucky enough to be asked to commentate on the IOC session in Singapore. I wasn't actually in Singapore. I was sitting in a little studio in Paris at 2 a.m. and the broadcast came through, and we're sitting there trying to interpret the pictures and basically looking at what's happening. My role was to identify when an IOC member spoke, well, this chap is interested in this because he's the president of ice hockey, or he's the president. He's asked this particular question because he's an athletics official, and so on and so forth. And then came the moment when the vote was being taken. And they played the Olympic hymn, and I said something like, well, the Olympic hymn is to give life to noble games, and will it now give life to the dreams of either London or Paris? And then Jack Rogge pulled open the envelope, and I looked at the fellow commentator there when he read out the words City of London, and mouthed to him, did he just say London? And then we were in the peculiar position of being in Paris and describing scenes in Trafalgar Square, which, for those who don't know London, is the big square in the centre of London with Nelson's Column, and it's a place where people gather, which wasn't so far from Horse Guards Parade, which was where they were going to have the beach volleyball in 2012. So we were able to identify that this was close to one of the key venues for the Games, because ever since beach volleyball came into the Olympics, everybody has wondered which place they were going to have. Obviously, you had Bondi Beach in 2000, the Copacabana in 2016, and below the Eiffel Tower just a few months ago in Paris. So it's always one of those venues that everybody looks for, where they're going to have the beach volleyball. And people like to see what the backdrop is as much as the actual sport. And Horse Guards Parade, which is where they always have the birthday parade, the official birthday of the sovereign, the late Queen, or now King Charles III. Every July, they have a military parade to celebrate his official birthday. So it was quite a special place to have a sporting event. And they even got their own sand come in, and they put God knows how many tons of sand down. And then they actually recycled the sand and sent it off to sports centres around the country so they could use it for beach volleyballs. So the whole idea was to be nice and sustainable. But having it in your home, and I know that people in Australia will be getting excited about Brisbane in 2032. The people in France started to feel very proud, especially as the Games went on, the fact that France had the Olympics. And we were certainly in the same scenario in London, where to start with, people were quite negative, and then gradually the momentum turned. And it became a golden fortnight where people were going up to visitors who were obviously lost and saying, oh, where do you want to get to? Have you been to an event? Where do you come from? All this sort of thing. And that's part of the Olympic magic, that point of people who are not sports stars coming together and joining in with the overall celebration that the Olympics are. And we saw it in Sydney in 2000. Yep. We certainly saw it in London in 2012, and we saw it in Paris in 2024, where to travel on the metro every night was to be part of an international party.
It's I've got a question about that section that you just mentioned there about the London announcement in a sec. But like, yeah, it is that vibe. I mean, you and I were talking off air about sort of experiences like that, and ultimately I never went to Sydney, but you could still feel it outside in different states. But my first real experience of a multi-sport event was the Commonwealth Games in 2018. I worked there, and I just remembered that feeling. You'd be on the train every night home and you would be talking to people, and then you would be waiting for a bus and, oh, what have you got tickets for? Like, what are you doing? What have you seen? Like, whatever. And I never forget the Monday morning after the closing ceremony, not only because I wanted to forget the closing ceremony, but we won't get into that, but like the vibe of the city, like changed on a dime. Like the day before, everyone was so like, oh, where are you going? What are you doing? What's happening? Isn't this great? Fantastic. To just everybody back in business suits, reading the newspaper on their phone, not wanting, like it was so fascinating. I always remember that photo the day after the Sydney closing ceremony on the Sydney Morning Herald or Daily Telegraph, and they had like a big park where it was just filled with like litter and streamers and everything, and there was maybe a person who had passed out from partying the night before, and like the headline was something like, party's over, or like sad, that we've got to get back to normal now or something like that, because it really is that vibe that sort of and I felt that in Paris, Philip. You felt it. Like I would speak to French people and they were like, we're not usually like this. We're not usually polite. We're not usually friendly. We don't really care for people, but right now we can't help it. Like this is great. We love it. So it really is a unique thing, that journey that a city will go on, kind of from that announcement to ultimately, that vibe. I wanted to just ask you on that London, but how do you, in that moment, when you are, I don't know if you are being told to be unbiased, you've got to be there as the voice of the people and be in that moment, but as a proud Brit, you're there, you're an Olympic fan, and you're sitting there at that moment that you're seeing your city being announced as a host city. I mean, do you remain calm? Do you allow yourself to celebrate? Because surely yourself in that moment, you're a regular human being. You're excited. Your city is hosting the Olympics in 7 years.
Well, the actual broadcast, we'd been going on, I think we've been on air since about 2 a.m. Because we'd done all the presentations and all the various preliminaries. And with any Olymp vote, what you get is you get the presentation of each host city. And there were London, just trying to remember them all now, London, New York,
I know New
Paris,
York was
Madrid.
one. I remember I was team New York, sorry to interrupt, because I'd signed up for a volunteer. I was so excited for the prospect of a New York Olympics, but I guess we talk about that another time.
Went to, I think it was Moscow went out first, and then New York.
Yeah,
and
New
then
York and had
Madrid.
early. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it became down. And of course, what happens is they do a vote, and they do it all on an electronic pad now. They don't send sheets in, and they have these scrutineers. And I remember that London, in order to vote for London, you had to press button number 8.
Right.
So I said, well, that's a good omen. To which my co-commentator sort of looked quizzical. And I said, well, 1908, London hosted the Olympics. And they also hosted it in 1948. So the 8 is a lucky number as far as London and the Olympics are concerned. So I was sticking to this bit. And so you have still everybody expected Paris to win. That's the bottom line. Paris were the favourites. But London actually played a brilliant hand. They had Tony Blair and David Beckham. And although the IOC bigwigs were insisting that David Beckham had no effect, the fact that he was there and everywhere and everybody wanted to see what Beckham was up to did have an effect, because it meant everybody was talking about London. And I do remember actually attending a couple of press conferences the year before in Athens, because each city was allowed to make a press conference. And at that time, some of the BBC investigations on the IOC were deemed to be harmful to London's bid. And it was very much the same, I think, with Sydney, where there were investigations into the IOC at the Salt Lake side of things. And the Australian, and even before that, the largesse that certain members had abused was deemed to be unpatriotic, because it was likely to sabotage the attempt for the bid. And so you had this going on, and London presented with Sebco leading the bid, a very vibrant group of men, women, young people, old people, very diverse group. And the French had a number of grey suits, and they had Marie-Josée Pérec, who you've seen in Paris. She was
With
one
the
of the
cauldron.
final people to light the cauldron, one of the gods of French sport.
Yeah.
And she was part of
Big
this
name in
panel.
Australia too, because she was Kathy's rival, right? So yeah,
Oh
we're very
yes,
familiar with her.
the
Yeah.
headlines I remember from Sydney, Madame
Sydney.
Le Chicken, after
Yeah.
she
She did a
disappeared
runner.
before the fight.
Yep.
But anyway, be that as it may, Marie-Josée Pérec was sitting on the end of this panel, and we waited for her to say something, and we waited. And in the end, it was all the 60-something grey suits in the middle. And we thought, what a bad vibe. And I don't think she did very much when they did the actual final presentation. Whereas
Wow.
London's bid had a kid talking, rather like Sydney. Sydney got a
Yeah.
youngster involved with their
Yep.
presentation in 1993. London did the same. You had the Princess, you had Sebco, you had Ken Livingstone, who was the mayor at that time, giving what I consider to be his best speech ever. It was really from the heart. It explained, he explained why he wanted London, his city, to have the games, and London got them by the most narrow of margins. And I I remember just trying to marshal my thoughts. One thing was I was trying to identify the piece of music that they were playing in the background as Beckham and the others were hugging, because being the sort of commentator who likes to have these kind of things, not something you could have prepared, because we didn't have a lit playlist of that sort of thing. We had a running order for the things, and I'd researched as much as I could. And I decided it was either Sir William Wharton or Gustav Holst, two great British composers. And I plumped for Sir William Wharton, and thank God I did, because what they were actually playing was the incidental music from Henry V, Victory
Wow.
at Agincourt, which is a film about an English victory over France in 1415, the Battle of Agincourt, a film with Sir Laurence Olivier from the 1940s. And this was the music that they'd chosen. And I don't think that they knew what they were playing there. They just found this nice bit of classical music. And I always think, in a way, it was kind of weird that they should be playing something about a great British victory over France, and a little bit insensitive, actually. But
Take
I
it.
don't think that they actually realised what they were. They just found this nice bit of music that they thought would work in the background. And of course, so I'm concentrating on identifying all the people. Oh, there's Beckham hugging, and there's the mayor and whoever else. So you're so concentrated on actually making sure that when you're on air, you know that you're basically on a high wire above a circus ring without a trampoline below, or a net below, a safety net, because you're live broadcasting. So it's get it right first and let the emotion come later. And because I'm a Londoner, I was able to add little extra bits about this and that, and put in the odd little bit about who was celebrating in Trafalgar Square. As it happened, it was Dame Kelly Holmes and Steve Cram and various others. And we were able to identify all these people. So you're concentrating so hard on that. And the emotion and realization that what had actually transpired didn't actually come until I was walking back along the River Seine, past the Eiffel Tower, which now had Paris 2012 in big letters on the Eiffel Tower, which now look very bedraggled, and past the Hotel de Ville, where they were taking down all the banners and the signs that would have been the celebration moment for them at the Hotel de Ville. And suddenly, blimey, we've got the Olympics. And I was humming to myself, maybe it's because I'm a Londoner, which everybody said, oh, that's very brave. But of course, the French probably wouldn't have recognized the song. But that was the moment when you suddenly realised, gosh, this is going to be something. Travelled home, got to Waterloo Station. All the newspaper headlines were there, and I have some lovely photographs of all the newspapers on that day. We've won, and London wins bid, and everything else, capturing that moment. Went over to Wembley Stadium that evening, having been up Mark you since about 2 a.m. So a very long day, probably about an 18-hour day by the time we got back. watch the lighting up of the arch where they were just still rebuilding Wembley Stadium. This was still a building site, so it wasn't open at that point, but they lit the arch in celebration of the moment that London had got the nomination for 2012.
Wow.
Then went into the office the following day, found out none of the telephones worked, and that was because the bomb attacks had happened in London.
I was going to say it's always sadly
yeah.
tainted, isn't it? That announcement that happened so soon after. I remember that vividly. That whole period of time. But it's such. This was a question I was going to ask you. Is that like, do we miss this, don't we? We miss this whole announcement and bid phase, and because like we just don't have that anymore. I mean, the Brisbane one was, let's be honest, lame compared to Sydney. There was like 20 people down at South Bank going, "Woo, we won the Olympics." Whereas 1993, you couldn't move in Circular Quay, and that was at like 4 a.m. for Australia. I mean, even we just saw it in Paris. We all but knew that the French Alps and Salt Lake had the Olympics, but it was just had to be rubber stamped. Here's a sign and here's a press conference. Like, I miss it. I miss it, Philip. I miss the pomp and pageantry of an Olympic election.
Well, I did actually say a few years ago that it was one of the events outside of the Olympics. One of the exciting things was the build up to the election, and there is real tension.
Yeah.
But I guess when Thomas Buck came in, he started this what he called a roadmap for his time as president, and this comes to an end in March next year after 12 years in charge of the IOC, and we'll have a new IOC president. But he had this roadmap called Agenda 2020. And one of the things was to make the bidding process more of a consultation and a work with, ask not what you can do for the Olympics, but ask what the Olympics can do for you kind of thing. And so they had this preferred bidder. And so in the end, Brisbane were in fact the only candidate. And everybody knew that Brisbane were going to be rubber stamped by the IOC session as host for 2032. And the same thing happened with the two Winter Olympics that we've just seen with Salt Lake, with Paris and the French Alps and Salt Lake. But I mean, in fact, before that, it was going that way because you had everybody was pulling out of the race for 2024, Budapest, Rome, right. I think, Hamburg, and so on and so forth. So you ended up with only two candidates, Paris and Los Angeles, both for 2024. Anyway, the IOC went behind the scenes and said, look, this is daft. We have a games in 2028. So will one of you agree to defer until 2028? And because it was the centenary of 1924, when Paris had the Chariots of Fire Olympics, this meant, therefore, that it made perfect sense for Paris to have the games 100 years on. And, of course, everybody caught that vibe that these were the last games that Baron Pierre de Coubertin was in charge for. Very different games. We had the hockey at Stade de Colombe, which was one of that was where the athletics took place in 1924, and you have Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams and all that stuff. So it had that sort of vibe from 1924 and Los Angeles 2028. And so they did a joint announcement there. And then, as you say, in Tokyo, I was at the watching the announcement from the IOC session, and Thomas Buck gets this envelope, and the winner is. I mean, it would have been a major surprise if Brisbane hadn't come out of that envelope.
Because the winner is Istanbul, and you were like, "What? Like what? Yeah, that came out of nowhere."
Well, this is the problem. And then, of course, all the people back in Brisbane, all the city fathers, were dancing around as if this was some great surprise.
It's so funny you say that, Philip, because literally it was a case of I think it was done at about 6 or 7 p.m. At that point. So the news was on. The nightly news was on, and they were like all prepared and ready for it. And I think there was a delay. And then I think at that time, because Channel 7 still had the Olympics, they missed the live announcement. This is like 3 days before Tokyo started. So it was a bit of a shit show, to be fair. But like the awkward thing about that was that like you have like Anastasia Palaszczuk there. She does this awkward jump up with the face mask on. They cut to our Prime Minister at the time, Scott Morrison, who's watching via Zoom, who does this real like awkward thumbs up to the camera, which was a meme the next day. Like it just wasn't the same as the winner is City. Like, is it? Like, and the circular key, like, I miss it. And, like, I don't think we're ever going to see it return back to the way it was. Like, I feel like we can just wake up tomorrow and T-Bark's just going to be like, oh, by the way, 2036 are in Saudi Arabia. Cool, let's move on. Like, it just feels like there's no pageantry and no thing around it like there
It is
used to be.
something that we miss. I mean, one of the problems was that what happened um, the last time Los Angeles got the games, they were the only candidate because Tehran pulled out in 1978. And even then, there were conditions, rather like with Salt Lake now with the whole drugs thing, there were conditions on whether they should stage the Olympics because they wanted to do it as privately financed because their government said, no way are we backing these games in any way, shape or form with money. And eventually they were, and they made a big profit. But then after Los Angeles made its, $220 million operating profit, whatever it was, other cities suddenly in 1986, when the bid came for 1992, you had 6 cities going, including Barcelona and Amsterdam,
Brisbane.
Belgrade, Birmingham, Brisbane, with Sally Ann Atkinson, the mayor. Yeah. So you had all these cities. And there were tales even then of largesse being explained, the hospitality, the gifts that were being sent to IOC members as inverted commas inducements to try and persuade them to vote. They were given a chance to go and visit these cities. I mean, who wouldn't want a 3-day trip, to Sydney, first class cruise around the harbour or cruise around, up to Brisbane, and very pleasant, sunshine everywhere, being looked after first class, taken to all these events, shown the facilities and so forth. And this just escalated over the next few games and came to a head with Salt Lake City. After they lost to Nagano, who mysteriously all their files were shredded after their bid. And then in Salt Lake City went for the next games and said, right, there is no way we are not going to get these games. We have the best facilities. We should go for them. And so lo and behold, in the bid for Salt Lake City, things were promised, scholarships, all kinds of other inducements were given, trips to go and see this, that, or the other. I think when Atlanta got the bid, they even arranged for golf-loving members of the IOC to go and play on the Augusta National, So there were some of these things experiences that money can't buy. And so they were trying to get away from that whole sort of excess, that culture
Which you can
of excess.
understand. I mean, you can understand that. You can absolutely understand it, but it doesn't. Yeah, old school people like us, we just remember what that felt like for those moments, right?
The tension for London, the tension before even, when was it, for Barcelona, and all these cities. And sometimes, I mean, in 1981, when Seoul and Nagoya, it was a complete shock because everybody expected Nagoya and Japan to get the games. And suddenly the IOC had decided to go for Seoul in South Korea. And as it turned out, ultimately, it was a genius stroke because the games were very memorable. As it turned out, Barcelona's games were very memorable. Atlanta were, everybody expected Athens would get them in the year of the centenary.
Even Sydney, Beijing were favourite, if I'm not mistaken, in 2000.
Yes, that's right.
And Sydney
Beijing,
only just won.
There was a whole thing. Sydney, Beijing, London, Manchester were bidding that time, and a few other cities. And everybody knew it was going to be, I think Berlin were even in that race as well, possibly. But everybody knew that it was basically a head-to-head between Australia and China. And there was even talk that of a discrediting campaign against China that was supposedly non-traceable to Sydney. And as soon as it came out that they were even contemplating it, somebody said, if you do that, you're basically committing bid suicide. So they dropped the bid. But the bid leader wrote about it in his, sort of memoirs after the event. But there were, exposés done, and it was said that a lot of the bids actually knew the shoe size of the second daughter of any IOC member, and detail of that
Wow.
level. There were dossiers going around that are being compiled by one bid, and that would be then sold to another bidding city. If you do
Wow.
this one likes golf, this one likes sailing, and so on and so forth. And obviously, it presupposes that certain people may have been susceptible to that kind of inducement, whereas a lot of people are incorruptible and would not allow that to happen. But of course, what never happened was that anybody really and truly called out any of these cities for doing these things until a Swiss official called Mark Hodler, who was the head of the International Ski Federation. And he was also an executive member of the IOC, member of the IOC executive board. So he was a very, very influential figure. He'd been president of the Ski Federation since the early 1960s. He'd been an IOC member since that time. So he was a really senior member of 40 years standing. And suddenly he started talking about these rumors he'd heard. And it turned out that he'd just heard rumors because people had been fishing around, so to speak, journalists and stuff. And then it all came out, and the whole Salt Lake City thing unraveled. There was an inquiry. The IOC had to sack 6 or 7 of their members who were found with their hands in the till and expelled in disgrace. And then, of course, that was the genesis for the idea of reforming the bid program. And of course, it's over the years, it became less overtly competitive. I suspect there were still things behind the scenes that were done much more discreetly. And then, of course, when Thomas Bach came in, we're going to put the cost of staging these games is becoming so much. People are pulling out left, right, and centre. I mean, when you get, say, Oslo, for example, were bidding at one stage for the 2018 Winter Olympics, or was it 2022? But they were bidding for one of those. Oslo, skiing, Norway, mad winter sports, a bit like Australia with some of the other sports like swimming.
Hosted a great Winter Olympics in '94 in Lillehammer, one of the most memorable Winter Olympics of all time.
And they are winter sports nuts out there.
Yep.
And for them to turn around and say, no, these games are not viable, I think that possibly set the alarm bells ringing with people like Thomas Bach and said, look, come on, we've got to do something about it. So maybe practically we lament those great moments because, I mean, I remember before Milan Cortina was chosen, the other city was Stockholm, which had a winter resort with it. And you had their bid. And during the bid, one of the members of the team actually started singing and quoting songs by a very famous Swedish pop group. You know, you'll be having the time of your life.
Don't know any of those. Never heard of them.
Oh, I can't think what the name of them was, but
ABBA.
It began with an A. It began with an A and ended
ABBA?
with
ABBA, maybe, possibly. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, Stockholm met their Waterloo. Sorry.
I want to play a sound effect all of a sudden. You're doing well here. Yep.
But no, and that was the last time, and Milan got the vote. But it was still, there was a degree of jeopardy because you weren't quite sure who was going to get it because on the scheme of things, both bids had reasonably, a very good bid. I mean, we had one for the 2018 games. I think Katharina Witt, the great skater, was heading up Munich's bid with the mountains as well in the Bavarian area. And that, again, looked a great bid, but Pyeongchang got it, I think partly because they've been trying so many times that in the end the IOC just took pity on them and said, let's try and help.
So you're saying Istanbul might get the Olympics then sometime in the next 50 years? Because I swear they're in it every single damn 4 years. Poor old Istanbul.
Well, they have this sort of idea of East meets West. I mean, obviously, it's still not the most stable area of the world. I mean, Budapest was in there before the First World War, and probably, had the First World War not happened, they'd have probably staged 1920. But because they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and aligned with the Kaiser, they were frozen out after that, and they've never staged the Olympics. And now, probably Budapest is too small a city to be able to contemplate the Olympics. Same with Amsterdam, which staged in 1928.
Yeah.
These days, it would be considered too small to host an Olympics.
My favorite Olympics that I just want to learn more and more about, and I'll talk to you about this off air, that maybe you can send me stuff if you know about it. Antwerp. Antwerp, to me, is the most unique city that has ever hosted an Olympics, and I just want to go to Belgium to visit Antwerp because I love the fact that Antwerp have hosted an Olympic Games.
It wasn't even Brussels, it was Antwerp, but
Yeah.
it was just after the First World War. They wanted, they'd actually slated the 1916 Olympics for Berlin.
Right.
And Berlin had been awarded the 1916 Olympics. They had a big ceremony in the Grunewald where they had this wonderful stadium, which became a horse racing stadium. And the Kaisers turned up, gymnasts, everything else in 1913. They sent officials, including a chap called Carl Diem, to the United States. And they came back with one of the American champions from the early years, Alvin Kranzlin, who was of German extraction. You will coach our athletes for the 1916 games. And even in 1914, when the war had been declared, there was still hope that they might be over by Christmas, and therefore that the games could go ahead in 1916. And the
Wow.
games never did. And this was like a ghost Olympics. It's still part of the sequence, mind you, because
Yeah.
these are called the games of the sixth Olympiad, not celebrated in the list. But that's why you've got fifth Olympiad Stockholm, seventh Olympiad Antwerp in 1920. And of
Interesting.
course, eventually they built the stadium in Berlin. The one that exists now for 1936 was built on the same site and just made bigger. But Antwerp in 1920 it basically went bankrupt. You're supposed to produce a full official report after every game, and all the other paraphernalia. And this wasn't produced until the 1950s because the organising committee ran out of money. So, but they had some interesting in things. They actually had winter sports in 1920, just
That's the
before the
ice
war.
hockey and figure skating, right? They had
That's
them in
right. Yeah,
19.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, they had winter sports in 1920. They had done in 1908 as well. They had figure skating in London,
Yeah.
and they actually what they did was they separate in those days. Sports had their own season, so you didn't have stuff out of season. For example, if you had a rugby tournament, you'd have it in September or October, not in the summer. And so, in fact, in 1908, the Australian rugby team happened to be touring Great Britain and ended up playing one match against Cornwall for the Olympic gold medal because Cornwall were the county champions and the Aussies won it. So, and then a lot of them turned professional and became rugby league players. But that's another story. But in 1920, you're right, they had ice hockey and ice skating.
And Britain,
And
did Britain
part
not
of
win
it
the
was
gold
that
medal? Did Britain not win the gold medal in ice hockey too?
they did, but in 1936 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen.
Oh,
And a
right.
lot of the
So,
players had
right.
learned the sport in Canada.
Right, because
But
I thought
Britain did
I
win the
always
first
remember
hurling gold.
I always remember Britain randomly being on the list of gold medalists in ice hockey. And I'm like, really?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's a bit like it's ice hockey's Stephen Bradbury moment,
Yeah.
basically. That that you get Great Britain winning. Admittedly, a lot of them because we had ice hockey was hugely popular in the 1930s and 40s domestically in Great Britain. Lots of rinks around everywhere. And what you had was a lot of Canadians coming over or Canadians with British heritage. So you'd have people who played ice hockey, learnt their ice hockey in Canada, and then came over and be part of the team. And I think most of them were actually born in England, emigrated, came back, blah blah blah. So that's how it worked. But
There's absolutely
1920,
nothing wrong with stealing Canadians and letting them win gold medals. We know that very well with a certain Dale Begg Smith in this country. So
well,
we gladly
that's
do
right.
that.
I mean, every country does it, and every country
Exactly.
vilifies every other country that does it. I mean, in Great Britain, they always talk of the Irish for doing such things, and yet they do the same thing. You have, I mean, there was a pole vaulter in Australia, Grigorieva, who was Russian, wasn't she? And
Tatiana
she competed
Grigorieva.
in,
Yep, that's
yeah,
correct. You've
and
just taken one of our Aussie cyclists, Matthew Richardson, just defected to Team GB after winning a couple of medals in Paris, and we're not too happy about that. So it
well,
happened.
if you're Irish, you can elect to compete for either Great Britain or for what would be called in other sports the Republic of Ireland, what is called in Olympic speak Ireland.
Interesting.
And very often it comes down to what the infrastructure is. Even if you're born in Belfast or Dublin, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
Um, so if somebody's in cycling or rowing, they'll probably go with Great Britain because they have a much better infrastructure. They're more likely to excel because the backup team is so very good in those sports, or even sailing.
Fascinating. There you
Whereas in
go.
box, you don't need so much in that way because it's much more of an. I know they're all individual sports, but boxing is the ultimate individual sport. You're in the ring on your own, aren't you?
Punching
So a
people.
lot
Yeah.
of, I mean, you had people like Wayne McCulloch and Michael Carruth who boxed for Ireland when they would have also been able to, had they wished, to have opted because they were, to box for Great Britain. So you've got that sort of dynamic going on as well. But
Very
I mean,
interesting. Very interesting.
in the early years, there was something called Olympic geography. Baron Pierre Coubertin had this idea. So, for example, if you look back at 1908, you've got a Finnish team, even though Finland was part of the Russian Empire at that time.
Hmm.
And you've got Bohemia, even when the Nazis took over in Czechoslovakia. There is a letter in a note in the IOC notice what to do with the Bohemian member, and the German members were saying, well, he should of course remain, and that sort of idea of this gentlemanly club. So there are a certain sort of political accommodations. I mean, we've had a refugee team in Paris, haven't we?
Yeah.
Again,
Yep.
they were talking of a refugee team for people from Russia who had been displaced by the Russian Revolution in 1924,
Wow.
and it came to nothing. And they tried again in the 1950s when all the people from the various Iron Curtain countries were fleeing. They tried to set up some kind of refugee representation then, and it came to nothing. Nowadays, I think you get a better hearing for it. But, so there
Definitely.
really is the whole thing with this whole Olympic story. Everybody says this is new, that's new. And nothing is new. I mean, even down to the fact, Will, we saw with Paris that they took the flame by a sailing ship from Piraeus to Marseille. And the Paris Organizing Committee actually claimed this was a first. It wasn't. In
Right.
1960, a flame went by sailing ship from Piraeus to Sicily and then up through to Rome for the Olympics. And even before that, they'd had nautical voyages. But everybody tries to reinvent that their thing is the first. I'm sure the Australians claimed things in 2000,
We would
and
never do
Brisbane.
that, Philip. What are you
No,
talking about?
of course not. But each organising committee tries to claim that they've done something unprecedented.
Yeah.
And if you look hard enough in the books, you'll find somebody's already been there before at some stage. There's always something with these various things. It's so. I mean, we do try and find first, and there are a few, but there always seems to be something that's like a little parallel that could be, applied to any given Olympic story. So the Olympic rings, the circular Olympic rings, are actually well chosen because things do come around, and what goes around comes around. So actually having the rings as the emblem of the Olympics means that there really is nothing new under the sun.
I'm not one for segues because I'm usually terrible at them, but I think it basically you've ended this interview in a way that I could never imagine, because let's be honest, way I started this, trying to go through your career, we've ended up at a point where I didn't think we were going to end up. But this is why I wanted to get you on the show, because you are a fountain of knowledge, Phil. I could talk to you for hours and you would tell me so many different things that an Olympic fan like myself is just going to soak up like a sponge. And I think that it's just been so fascinating to ask you a simple question, and then we've gotten to a point now where we're learning so many things. So I definitely think moving forward that we need to get you back on, and we need to maybe have some themed episodes, or we can do something here, because seriously, you have one of the best jobs on the planet, an Olympic historian. I want to grow up and be just like you. So I just want to say, through that ring analogy that we've gotten from that point to here, that I can close this off. And I've literally probably only asked you two of the questions I wanted to ask you. So we need to make this something more regular, I think. You've whet my appetite, something chronic here, my friend.
Well, I tell you, the thing is, there's so much in the Olympic movement.
Yeah.
If you go, say, to St Pancras Station, you walk past a building that had a central role in trying to establish Olympic style activity in the 1860s. You
Wow.
go to a place, there's a village in Shropshire that started Olympian competitions. You go back to Gloucestershire, and there's a place that had Olympic games in the 1600s. So,
Hmm.
everywhere you go, you find that there are little connections. I mean, you've got in Australia, you've got the MCG, which is one of
Yeah.
the most historic venues in the world because that's had Test cricket, it's had football. Let's
Olympics,
hope one
Commonwealth
day
Games.
Australia gets the men's football World Cup as
Yeah.
well as the women's, because I think it will be absolutely splendid. And the MCG would surely be part of that, or the G, I think you call it, don't you?
We
But
absolutely call it. And I'm not biased at all when I say that to me it's the greatest sporting venue on the planet. But I'm sure, I mean, you
yeah,
might argue Wembley. You've
it's got
partial to
that
that.
vibe to it, and
Oh, yeah.
and you find that. I mean, I spent some time a few years ago looking at the history of the Aboriginal cricket team of
Mm-hmm.
1868 because we
Yep.
had a couple of special tours that I was lucky enough to meet the people from, particularly in 2018, of the Indigenous team that had Dan Christian and Scott Boland and Ashley Gardner, the women's player. And you find that all these things have a connection, and you find that somebody who's connected with that is then connected with some other sport, and is connected with either the Olympic movement or something to do with football, with cricket, with rugby, whatever. And as you go back, you find that the same individuals pop up in various sports.
Yeah.
There was a chap called Charles Alcock in Britain who was an entrepreneur, secretary of Surrey County Cricket Club, therefore basically the organizer of the first cricket test match, but
Hmm.
also the secretary of the Football Association and the organizer of the first FA Cup final, which is why
Oh,
that was played
wow.
at the Oval Cricket Ground in London.
Jeez.
And anybody from Australia will know that the Oval Cricket Ground is where the famous obituary, in affectionate remembrance of English cricket, the body will be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia after Australia had beaten England in a very famous cricket match in 1882. So
Hence the
you've
Ashes were
got all
born.
these little
Yeah.
connections, and they just keep coming up. You've got a president of FIFA who swam in the Olympics, a fellow called João Havelange, who was president of FIFA. And you think, oh, he must have played football in the Olympics. No, he swam and he played water polo. So you have all
Insane.
these personalities bubbling through, and everywhere you go, you find new avenues. You suddenly look up a book and suddenly a light comes on. Oh, yes, that's so and so who did something else. I mean, there was an American president who got honored by the Olympic movement because of his interest and excitement about sport, Teddy Roosevelt. So, you have all these connections, and some of them, the great beauty is that although a lot of stuff has been found out in the last 20, 30 years, there's still something new to discover somewhere.
And this is why you're so good at your job, because you're out there doing it, and you're able to tell these amazing stories. Philip, I seriously mean it. We're going to get you back on. We're gonna hear more stories. We're going to find out more and get so many things out there from your amazing brain. But we really appreciate your time today to start this hopefully journey with you being on this show. And I really look forward to hearing more from you in the future, because it's been an absolutely fascinating chat today.
Thank you very much. And good wishes to everybody. Let's hope that the next year of sport is as good as this last one has been.